The most scandalous and controversial pharaohs in history. Ancient Egypt is often remembered as a land of order, balance, and divine rule. The pharaoh was not merely a king, but a living god, chosen by the heavens to maintain harmony between the mortal world and the gods. Statues carved in stone show calm faces, perfect symmetry, and eternal control. But behind this carefully constructed image of perfection lies a far more disturbing reality. Because when power is absolute, and when rulers are believed to be divine, there are no limits. Hidden behind temple walls, erased from official records, and whispered through later historians, the lives of some pharaohs reveal obsession, excess, taboo, and moral decay. These were rulers who crossed boundaries, sometimes legal, sometimes cultural, and sometimes human, protected by their status as gods on earth. Tonight, we explore the most scandalous and controversial pharaohs in history. Not through myth or exaggeration, but through ancient texts, archaeological clues, and historical analysis. This is not fantasy. This is power without restraint. Let us begin. Akhenaten, the heretic king of obsession. Akhenaten was not Egypt's most violent ruler, but he may have been its most disturbing in a different way. Born Amenhotep IV, he ruled during the 18th dynasty, a golden age of Egyptian wealth and influence. Yet instead of strengthening the empire, Akhenaten turned inward, obsessed with a single god, a single idea, and possibly a single person. He abandoned the traditional gods of Egypt, Amun, Osiris, Isis, and replaced them with Aten, the physical sun disk. This was not just religious reform. It was religious domination. Temples were shut down. Priests lost power. The entire spiritual identity of Egypt was rewritten by one man's fixation. But the obsession did not stop at religion. Akhenaten ordered himself depicted in bizarre ways: elongated skull, wide hips, narrow chest, nothing like any pharaoh before or after. Some scholars believe this was symbolic. Others believe it reflected a deep psychological break from tradition. Even more controversial was his relationship with Queen Nefertiti. In reliefs, they are shown in intimate domestic scenes never before seen in royal art, kissing, touching, sitting beneath the sun disk together while their daughters play nearby. This was shocking in a culture where pharaohs were portrayed as distant gods, not emotional partners. Some historians believe Akhenaten's fixation on Nefertiti went beyond devotion. It may have crossed into exclusive obsession, isolating himself from advisors, generals, and reality itself. While Akhenaten focused on theology and personal ideology, Egypt's borders collapsed. Enemies advanced. Allies abandoned Egypt. Letters from desperate governors went unanswered. When he died, Egypt erased him. His statues were smashed. His name was chiseled from stone. His city abandoned. To the Egyptians who followed, Akhenaten was not just a failed ruler, he was a dangerous deviant who broke the cosmic order. Ramses II, power, pleasure, and possession. Ramses the Great is remembered as Egypt's greatest builder and warrior. But behind the monuments lies another story, one of extreme excess made possible only by unchecked authority. Ramses II ruled for over 66 years and reportedly fathered more than 100 children. This alone was not unusual for a pharaoh, but the circumstances raise serious ethical questions. Royal women were not equals. They were possessions, political tools, symbols of dominance. Ramses married multiple queens, foreign princesses, and concubines. But most disturbing to modern historians is the strong evidence that several of his wives were his own daughters, a practice tolerated, and sometimes encouraged, to preserve divine bloodlines. In Egyptian belief, the pharaoh's blood was sacred. Keeping it pure justified unions that would be considered deeply taboo in any other context. But justification does not erase reality. These marriages were not romantic. They were expressions of absolute ownership, of family, body, and future. Ramses also demanded constant adoration. His image was everywhere. His name carved over the monuments of earlier kings. Even achievements that were not his were claimed as such. To question Ramses was to question a god. And no one survived that. PP2, the king who never let go. PP2 became pharaoh at around 6 years old and ruled for over 90 years, making him one of the longest reigning monarchs in human history. But his reign is remembered not for greatness, only for decay. Ancient sources describe a ruler increasingly detached from governance, surrounded by indulgence and secrecy. One particular account, recorded by later historians, claims PP2 had a trusted court official who visited him at night in secret, so secretly that servants were ordered to scatter sand on the paths to hide footprints. Whether this relationship was political, personal, or something more, the secrecy itself was the scandal. What matters is not speculation, but what followed. Under PP2, Egypt collapsed. Famine spread. Authority weakened. The central government disintegrated. While the king lived longer than any before him, Egypt itself died around him. Some rulers let go of power. PP2 never did. And the cost was everything. Why these stories were buried? Egyptian history was written by those in power. Official inscriptions were propaganda. Failures were erased. Scandals were hidden. Deviations were punished with silence. When we uncover these stories, we are not judging ancient people by modern standards, we are revealing what absolute power does to the human mind. When a ruler is called a god, there is no accountability. When desire meets divinity, boundaries disappear. And when no one can say no, corruption becomes invisible. Cleopatra VII is often remembered as a romantic icon, an irresistible queen who captivated the most powerful men in Rome. But this image was not accidental. It was carefully engineered, and behind it lies one of the most calculated uses of power, image, and manipulation in ancient history. Cleopatra did not inherit a stable throne. The Ptolemaic dynasty was already decaying, plagued by internal rivalries, assassinations, and marriages within the family that blurred every moral boundary. In her world, survival required more than intelligence. It required control. Cleopatra was raised in a court where siblings married siblings and rivals disappeared quietly. From an early age, she learned that affection was political currency and loyalty could be manufactured. When she ascended the throne, she did not rule by force alone, she ruled by psychological dominance. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not love stories. They were strategic bonds designed to protect Egypt from Roman annexation. Cleopatra understood something few rulers did. Perception could be more powerful than armies. She presented herself as the living embodiment of Isis, the divine mother goddess. To question Cleopatra was to question the gods themselves. This was not vanity, it was survival. But her power came at a cost. Cleopatra eliminated siblings who threatened her claim. She controlled narratives. She blurred lines between politics, divinity, and personal authority so completely that no one could separate the ruler from the myth. To later historians, this manipulation appeared immoral. To Cleopatra, it was necessary. And when Rome finally crushed her, it didn't just conquer Egypt, it destroyed her image, rewriting her legacy as a seductress instead of a strategist. History did not forgive her. Brilliance. The royal incest system, when bloodline became obsession. One of the most disturbing aspects of ancient Egyptian royalty was not hidden, it was institutionalized. Royal incest was not rare. It was expected. Pharaohs were believed to be gods on earth. Their blood was sacred. To dilute it through marriage with commoners was unthinkable. As a result, siblings married siblings, and in some cases, parents married children, not out of desire, but out of ideology. This practice created generations of rulers born into isolation, surrounded only by family members who were also political rivals. Love was secondary. Power was everything. Over time, the consequences became visible. Mummies revealed genetic deformities, weakened immune systems, and physical abnormalities. The most famous example is Tutankhamun, whose fragile health is widely believed to be the result of generations of close-kin marriages. But the psychological damage was just as severe. Growing up in a world where family bonds were political tools created rulers who viewed people as objects, useful or disposable. Loyalty was demanded, not earned. Affection was controlled, not shared. This system did not create monsters overnight. It trained them. Seti I, control through fear and ritual. Seti I is often remembered as a disciplined military leader and restorer of Egypt's glory. Yet behind the polished image was a ruler deeply invested in ritualized control. Seti believed that order could only be maintained through constant reinforcement of authority. Punishment was ceremonial. Obedience was public. Fear was sacred. Temples under Seti's rule emphasized submission to the pharaoh's will as divine law. Priests who deviated from approved doctrine were removed. Local traditions were overwritten by centralized ideology. What made Seti controversial was not cruelty, but obsession with dominance. Every act of worship reinforced his position. Every ritual reminded the people that resistance was not rebellion against a king, but against the universe itself. This blurred line between governance and psychological conditioning would influence later rulers, creating a culture where obedience was internalized rather than enforced. And once fear becomes belief, control becomes permanent. Tutankhamun, the child king trapped by adult sins. Tutankhamun did not choose his life. Born into the aftermath of Akhenaten's religious chaos, Tut was placed on the throne as a child, a symbolic ruler controlled by powerful officials who needed legitimacy. He married his half-sister. He performed rituals he barely understood. He ruled a kingdom struggling to repair damage done by adults before him. Tutankhamun's body tells a tragic story: frailty, illness, pain. His short life was not one of indulgence, but of confinement. Every decision made for him reinforced a system that had already doomed him. In many ways, Tutankhamun was not scandalous. He was a victim of scandalized power structures. And his death marked the quiet end of a dynasty too broken to continue. When gods become untouchable, the common thread among these rulers is not cruelty or desire, it is untouchability. When a ruler is divine, criticism becomes heresy. When tradition justifies excess, morality dissolves. When power is inherited, not earned, accountability disappears. Ancient Egyptians believed chaos would destroy the world if order failed. Ironically, their obsession with maintaining order through divine kings created rulers who embodied chaos behind closed doors. These were not monsters born evil. They were humans elevated beyond consequence. And history paid the price. Much of what we know about Egypt's darkest royal behavior does not come from Egyptian records at all. It comes from outsiders. Greek historians, Roman writers, and later chroniclers were not bound by Egyptian religious taboos. They were willing to record rumors, scandals, and moral accusations that official Egyptian scribes deliberately erased. These accounts must be treated carefully. But when multiple independent sources describe the same patterns, historians pay attention. And the patterns are disturbing. The whispered courts, when palaces became closed worlds. Royal courts in ancient Egypt were sealed environments. Access to the pharaoh was tightly controlled. Servants swore oaths of silence. Priests doubled as informants. Everyone watched everyone else. This isolation created conditions where abnormal behavior could thrive unnoticed. Greek historian Herodotus wrote of Egyptian kings who lived entirely separated from ordinary people, interacting only with chosen attendants. According to him, some rulers trusted no one outside a tiny inner circle, creating echo chambers where desire and paranoia fed each other. When no opposing voice exists, judgment collapses. Court officials learned quickly that survival depended on compliance, not morality. Silence was rewarded. Obedience ensured status. Questioning authority meant disappearance. Over time, this system protected behavior that would otherwise have provoked outrage. Neferneferuaten, the ruler history couldn't define. One of the most controversial figures in Egyptian history is Neferneferuaten, a ruler whose identity remains debated. Some scholars believe this was Nefertiti ruling alone. Others believe it was a co-regent or successor created to preserve Akhenaten's ideology. What makes Neferneferuaten scandalous is not behavior, but existence. This ruler deliberately blurred gender roles, royal traditions, and succession norms. Titles traditionally reserved for male pharaohs were used interchangeably with female forms. Artistic depictions broke conventions deliberately. To later dynasties, this was dangerous. Not because it was immoral, but because it threatened the rigidity of power itself. Egyptian rule depended on predictability. Anything that destabilized identity, lineage, or symbolism had to be erased. Neferneferuaten was wiped from history almost as thoroughly as Akhenaten. When history refuses to name you, it is not forgetfulness. It is punishment. Amenhotep III, luxury as a form of control. Amenhotep III ruled during one of Egypt's wealthiest periods. His reign was peaceful, prosperous, and saturated with indulgence. But prosperity can hide decay. Amenhotep surrounded himself with luxury to an unprecedented degree: lavish palaces, pleasure lakes, elaborate festivals celebrating his own divinity. Foreign rulers sent daughters to his court as diplomatic offerings. These women were absorbed into the royal household, symbols of submission disguised as alliances. Amenhotep did not conquer with armies. He conquered through excess. By normalizing indulgence, he shifted royal culture away from responsibility and toward entitlement. Later pharaohs inherited not just power, but expectation. And expectation breeds abuse. The erasure of uncomfortable pharaohs. Egypt did not record failure. When a ruler embarrassed the state, challenged tradition, or disrupted divine order, they were removed, not physically, but historically. Names were chiseled away. Statues smashed. Cartouches destroyed. Official king lists skipped entire reigns as if they never happened. This was not random vandalism. It was ideological cleansing. To exist in history, a pharaoh had to conform, not morally, but symbolically. Those who deviated too far from acceptable power structures were deemed threats to cosmic balance. Scandal alone was not enough to be erased. Scandal plus instability was unforgivable. Why perversion meant something different then? Modern language fails ancient reality. What we call perversion today was often framed as divinity, tradition, or necessity in ancient Egypt. Behavior was not judged by personal ethics, but by whether it maintained order. If an act preserved the illusion of stability, it was justified. If it threatened authority, it was condemned. This moral flexibility allowed rulers to excuse nearly anything, as long as power remained intact. And once that logic took hold, limits vanished. The true danger of divine rule. The most controversial pharaohs were not shocking because of desire or indulgence. They were dangerous because they could not be corrected. No courts. No opposition. No public accountability. When a ruler believes the universe itself supports their will, self-restraint becomes irrelevant. Ancient Egypt understood chaos deeply, but failed to recognize it when it wore a crown. To understand why so many Egyptian rulers crossed moral, cultural, and psychological boundaries, we must understand the system that created them. Ancient Egypt did not simply give power to its kings. It removed them from humanity. From the moment a pharaoh ascended the throne, they were no longer treated as a person. They were treated as a living symbol, an embodiment of cosmic order itself. This transformation was not symbolic. It was enforced daily, ritually, and socially. And it changed everything. The psychological cost of being a god. Pharaohs were raised from childhood to believe they were fundamentally different from everyone else. They did not walk among common people. They did not hear honest criticism. They did not experience normal family relationships. Every interaction reinforced superiority. Servants bowed. Priests affirmed divinity. Artists depicted perfection. Even mistakes were reframed as divine will. Over time, this environment erased empathy. When consequences disappear, behavior drifts. When correction is impossible, desire becomes law. Many controversial pharaohs were not born corrupt. They were shaped by a system that rewarded excess and punished restraint. To deny oneself pleasure made no sense if one was a god. Secrecy as a tool of power. One of the most consistent traits among scandal-associated pharaohs was secrecy. Private chambers were vast. Access was limited. Movements were concealed behind layers of ritual. Servants were rotated to prevent familiarity. Knowledge was compartmentalized. This was not paranoia. It was strategy. By controlling information, pharaohs controlled reality. What happened behind palace walls could be denied, reframed, or erased entirely. Truth was not what occurred, it was what survived inscription. Greek writers described Egyptian kings who avoided public appearances entirely, emerging only for ceremonies designed to reinforce awe. The less people knew, the more powerful the illusion became. Mystery protected authority. Religion as a shield for excess. Religion in ancient Egypt was not separate from politics, it was its foundation. Every royal action was justified through divine narrative. Temples reinforced obedience. Priests taught that loyalty to the pharaoh was loyalty to the universe. This system allowed behavior to be excused if it could be framed as sacred duty. Ritual marriages preserved divine blood. Isolation preserved purity. Punishment preserved order. Even indulgence could be reframed as divine privilege. Once religion stopped restraining power and started defending it, morality lost its anchor. The court that never said no. Royal courts were ecosystems of survival. Officials learned quickly that agreement meant advancement, while resistance meant removal. Over time, advisors stopped offering guidance and started offering validation. The pharaoh did not hear truth. He heard echoes. This dynamic intensified controversial behavior, not because anyone approved of it, but because no one dared challenge it. Silence became complicity. Tradition became excuse. And power fed on itself. Dynastic decay, when excess became inherited. The later dynasties of Egypt inherited not just thrones, but habits. Ritualized entitlement passed from ruler to ruler. Incestuous marriage patterns continued. Isolation deepened. Obsession with legacy overtook responsibility. By the time foreign powers arrived, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Egypt's internal authority was already hollow. The system that once created stability had begun producing fragility. Scandal was not the cause of collapse. It was a symptom. Why Egypt couldn't reform itself? Unlike societies that allow rebellion or reform, Egypt viewed disruption as existential threat. To question the pharaoh was to threaten cosmic order. Reform was chaos. Change was danger. So instead of correcting flawed rulers, Egypt erased them. But erasure does not heal. It only delays collapse. The final irony of divine power. The most controversial pharaohs believed they were protecting Egypt's order, even as they undermined it. Their excess was framed as tradition. Their isolation was framed as purity. Their dominance was framed as necessity. Yet each step away from accountability weakened the system that sustained them. By the end, Egypt was still rich in monuments, but poor in resilience. Stone endured. Authority did not. As Egypt's political power weakened, something else happened quietly but decisively. Control over the story was lost. For centuries, Egyptian priests and scribes decided what the world knew about their rulers. But when foreign powers took control, Egypt's past was no longer protected by its own narrative. Outsiders began writing the history, and they were far less forgiving. This is where many pharaohs were transformed from divine figures into moral warnings. Pharaohs remembered only through accusation. Some rulers are known not through monuments or inscriptions, but through hostile commentary. Later Greek and Roman writers described Egyptian kings as decadent, isolated, obsessed with ritual, and disconnected from reality. While these accounts were often exaggerated, they reflect how Egypt's rulers were perceived once their divine shield collapsed. To the Romans, a man who claimed godhood while indulging in excess was not sacred. He was ridiculous. And ridicule is more damaging than rebellion. Cleopatra and the end of divine illusion. By the time Cleopatra ruled, the age of unquestioned divine kingship was ending. Rome did not believe in living gods. It believed in dominance, law, and public accountability, at least in theory. Cleopatra's attempt to rule through divine imagery and psychological authority worked within Egypt, but failed internationally. Roman propaganda reframed her power as corruption. Her intelligence became manipulation. Her authority became immorality. Her control became danger. By destroying her image, Rome justified conquering Egypt not as an invasion, but as a moral necessity. This was the final humiliation of divine rule. The gods were no longer feared. They were judged. When pharaohs became curiosities, under Roman control, Egypt's rulers were no longer divine symbols. They became historical artifacts. Temples turned into tourist sites. Royal mummies were collected, displayed, and examined. The bodies of gods were unwrapped for curiosity. This was unthinkable centuries earlier. The pharaohs who once commanded silence were now objects of study. Power had not just faded. It had reversed. The long shadow of royal excess. Modern Egyptology continues to uncover evidence of how deeply excess and isolation shaped royal behavior. Letters show neglect. Burials reveal genetic consequences. Erased names hint at scandal. None of this means ancient Egypt was uniquely immoral. It means absolute power behaves the same way in every era. Egypt simply preserved the evidence in stone. What these pharaohs teach us. The most controversial pharaohs were not villains in the modern sense. They were products of a system that removed limits. When authority is sacred, accountability disappears. When tradition excuses behavior, correction becomes impossible. When leaders are untouchable, decay becomes inevitable. Ancient Egypt lasted thousands of years not because its rulers were perfect, but because its institutions were resilient. When those institutions began serving rulers instead of restraining them, collapse followed. As Egypt moved deeper into decline, the nature of scandal changed. In earlier periods, controversial behavior was hidden, ritualized, or erased. But in Egypt's later centuries, corruption became visible. Authority weakened. Control slipped. And pharaohs who once ruled like gods now struggled to rule at all. This is when the contrast between divine image and human reality became impossible to ignore. The late pharaohs, gods without power. During the late period, Egypt was no longer the unchallenged superpower it once had been. Foreign influence crept in slowly, first through trade, then diplomacy, then domination. Pharaohs still claimed divine status, but fewer people believed it. These rulers clung tightly to ritual, ceremony, and symbolism, hoping tradition alone could preserve authority. But rituals cannot replace strength, and belief cannot be commanded forever. Scandal in this era was no longer about excess. It was about desperation. Psamtik III, the king who could not command fear. Psamtik III ruled during Egypt's final days of independence before Persian conquest. Unlike earlier pharaohs, he did not inspire awe. He inherited a throne weakened by internal division and external pressure. His authority depended more on tradition than respect. When the Persians invaded, Egypt's defenses collapsed quickly. Psamtik was captured alive, a humiliation unimaginable in earlier dynasties. According to later accounts, the Persian king Cambyses II deliberately mocked Egyptian royal customs, parading Psamtik publicly to demonstrate that Egypt's gods had failed. For the first time, a pharaoh was not just defeated. He was exposed. Cambyses II, the outsider who broke the illusion. Cambyses II was not Egyptian, but his impact on the image of pharaohs was devastating. After conquering Egypt, Cambyses claimed the title of pharaoh, but openly disregarded Egyptian religious traditions. Greek sources describe him as mocking sacred rituals and treating divine symbols with contempt. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories mattered. They told Egyptians something unthinkable. A ruler could wear the crown and not believe. The pharaoh was no longer automatically divine. The spell was broken. When scandal became political weapon, foreign rulers quickly learned that undermining Egypt's sacred kingship weakened resistance. Mock the gods, and the throne collapses. Discredit rituals, and loyalty dissolves. What had once protected controversial behavior now made Egypt vulnerable. The same divine system that excused excess became a liability when outsiders refused to respect it. Power that depends on belief cannot survive disbelief. The priests' last attempt at control. In Egypt's final centuries, priests attempted to reclaim authority by tightening ritual laws and emphasizing moral order. But it was too late. Centuries of unchecked power had eroded trust. The population followed tradition out of habit, not faith. Without genuine belief, religion could no longer restrain rulers or save them. The system that once produced gods now produced hollow symbols. Why some pharaohs seem worse than others? Not all controversial pharaohs were equally extreme. Some appear shocking because more evidence survived. Others seem tame because records were destroyed. History does not preserve fairness, it preserves fragments. What matters is not ranking rulers by scandal. It is understanding why scandal repeated itself. And the answer is always the same. Too much power. Too little accountability. Too much silence. The lasting damage to Egypt's image. By the time Rome absorbed Egypt, the idea of the pharaoh as a god was no longer taken seriously. Roman writers portrayed Egyptian rulers as exotic, indulgent, and outdated. This image shaped Western understanding of Egypt for centuries, often unfairly, but not without cause. The scandals of a few rulers overshadowed the achievements of many. Legacy was rewritten. The quiet end of divine kings. Egypt did not fall in one dramatic moment. It faded, temple by temple, ritual by ritual, belief by belief. The pharaohs who once commanded the sun could no longer command loyalty. And when belief ended, so did divine rule. Modern historians approach Egypt's controversial rulers very differently than ancient scribes or Roman critics. Instead of asking whether these pharaohs were good or bad, scholars now ask a deeper question. What kind of system produces the same patterns over and over again? Because when scandal repeats across centuries, it stops being personal failure and becomes structural design. How modern history re-examines pharaonic scandal. Early Egyptology often accepted Greek and Roman accusations at face value. Pharaohs were portrayed as decadent, strange, or morally extreme. But archaeology complicated that picture. Excavations revealed administrative efficiency beneath indulgence. Letters showed concern for statecraft alongside ritual excess. Medical examinations of mummies exposed not monsters, but fragile, over-controlled humans shaped by expectations from birth. The truth lies between propaganda and idealization. Many pharaohs were neither saints nor villains. They were trapped. What archaeology confirms? Physical evidence confirms several uncomfortable realities. Royal mummies show clear signs of genetic stress caused by generations of close-kin marriage. This was not rumor, it is biological fact. Palace layouts confirm extreme isolation, with entire wings dedicated to privacy and secrecy. Movement was controlled. Access was restricted. Visibility was curated. Religious inscriptions repeatedly equate obedience to the pharaoh with cosmic survival, proof that belief was deliberately engineered. Scandal was not accidental. It was protected. What archaeology challenges? At the same time, archaeology challenges some ancient accusations. Many behaviors described as immoral by Greek writers were culturally normal within Egypt's symbolic framework. Outsiders misunderstood ritual language as literal action, symbolism as indulgence. Not every accusation reflects reality. But even exaggeration reveals something important. Outsiders saw Egyptian power as abnormal. And abnormal power attracts suspicion. Why perversion is a modern word for an ancient problem. The word perversion implies deviation from a moral norm. But whose norm? Ancient Egypt did not operate on modern ethical frameworks. It operated on balance, symbolism, and continuity. Actions were judged not by personal morality, but by whether they preserved order. This does not excuse harm. It explains repetition. When morality is replaced by ritual, boundaries blur. When authority is sacred, restraint disappears. What looks like excess is often unchecked tradition. Pop culture and the myth of the decadent pharaoh. Modern media loves extremes. Movies portray pharaohs as cruel tyrants or indulgent mystics. This sells drama, but flattens reality. In truth, the most dangerous pharaohs were not loud villains. They were quiet administrators who inherited unquestioned authority and history remembers systems. Why these stories still matter? Ancient Egypt feels distant, but its lesson is timeless. Whenever leaders are elevated beyond criticism, systems decay. Whenever tradition silences accountability, abuse spreads. Whenever belief replaces oversight, scandal becomes invisible. Egypt is not unique. It is a warning preserved in stone. The pharaohs as mirrors, not monsters. The most controversial pharaohs were not simply corrupt individuals. They were mirrors reflecting the dangers of absolute authority. They remind us that power does not corrupt suddenly. It isolates slowly. And isolation is the most dangerous force of all. By the time Egypt's story reached the modern world, the pharaohs were no longer living gods, fallen rulers, or political threats. They had become symbols. And symbols are easy to misunderstand. How modernized distort ancient power. Modern audiences often approach ancient Egypt with modern moral expectations. We look for villains, heroes, and clear lines between right and wrong. But ancient Egypt did not think this way. Power was not something to be questioned. It was something to be maintained. The pharaoh's duty was not to be morally pure, it was to keep the universe stable. When modern observers label certain pharaohs as perverted or depraved, they are reacting to behavior that violated modern sensibilities, not ancient ones. This does not mean the behavior was harmless. It means the danger lay deeper than individual actions. The real scandal, normalized excess. The most shocking realization for historians is not what some pharaohs did, but how normal it was within the system. Royal isolation was routine. Marriage within the family was institutional. Absolute obedience was expected. Personal desire was protected by theology. Scandal only emerged when the system failed to hide it. As long as Egypt remained strong, excess was invisible. When weakness appeared, the same behaviors were suddenly rebranded as corruption. Power determines morality. When history became entertainment. In later centuries, especially during the Roman and modern eras, Egyptian rulers were transformed into spectacles. Writers emphasized exotic rituals. Artists exaggerated decadence. Storytellers simplified complex power structures into shocking anecdotes. The pharaoh became a character, not a ruler. This transformation erased nuance and amplified scandal, ensuring that controversial figures would be remembered not for governance, but for rumor. History became theater. Why some names survived and others did not. Many pharaohs ruled quietly, efficiently, and without controversy. Their names are barely known today. Others left behind ruins, erased inscriptions, or hostile accounts. Visibility creates reputation. The most scandal-associated pharaohs are not necessarily the worst rulers, but the ones whose power structures collapsed visibly enough to leave traces. Silence protected many. Exposure condemned a few. The difference between power and control. One of Egypt's greatest contradictions was confusing control with strength. Control relies on fear, ritual, and isolation. Strength relies on adaptability, trust, and accountability. For centuries, Egypt mistook control for stability. When the world changed, through invasion, trade, or cultural contact, control failed instantly. Strength had never been developed. The pharaohs who seemed most powerful were often the least resilient. Why the system could not save itself. Even when Egypt's elites recognized decline, reform was impossible. To change the role of the pharaoh would mean admitting the gods could be wrong. To limit royal authority would mean questioning the universe itself. So instead of reforming, Egypt doubled down on tradition. And tradition, when frozen, becomes fragile. The final transformation of the pharaoh. By the end, the pharaoh ceased to be a god, then ceased to be a ruler, and finally became a relic. Mummified. Catalogued. Studied. The same bodies once worshipped were measured with calipers. The same names once whispered with reverence were debated in lecture halls. Divinity did not survive contact with time. What remains after the scandal fades? Strip away rumor, accusation, and exaggeration, and something important remains. A civilization wrestling with power. A system trying to eternalize authority. And humans trapped inside divine roles they did not design. The most controversial pharaohs are not remembered because they were shocking. They are remembered because they reveal what happens when power outgrows restraint. As we near the end of our exploration, one truth becomes unavoidable: scandal is only part of the story. The true lesson of Egypt's controversial pharaohs lies in power itself, how it is gained, maintained, and ultimately lost. The fallacy of divine immunity. Pharaohs were considered gods. Their word was law. Their will, absolute. Yet history proves that no divinity guarantees security. Akhenaten's religious revolution isolated him. Pepitu's long reign ended in neglect and chaos. Even Ramses II, who lived decades as a living god, left successors unprepared for the empire's decline. Divinity without accountability is fragile. The very system designed to protect rulers often created the conditions for collapse. Scandal as a byproduct of power. Much of what modern observers label scandal, incestuous marriages, isolation, ritual obsession, was not motivated by greed or lust alone. It was motivated by power preservation. Royal excess was strategic. Control over lineage, religion, and perception ensured the pharaoh remained unchallenged. Deviations from what we might call moral norms were tolerated because they served a larger political purpose. In other words, scandal was often structural, not personal. The duality of history and legacy. Egyptian rulers attempted to eternalize themselves through monuments, inscriptions, and rituals. Stone endures where reputations do not. Some pharaohs survived in glory, monuments, temples, and the reverence of later generations. Others survived only as whispers in foreign histories, erased, criticized, or misunderstood. Modern scholarship allows us to separate myth from system, rumor from reality. And what emerges is more remarkable than any scandal: a civilization that wrestled with power, morality, and eternity simultaneously. The universal lesson of Egypt's rulers. Pharaohs were humans elevated to godhood, yet they could not escape human limitations. Absolute power isolates. Sacred authority hides consequences. Tradition shields behavior that would otherwise fail scrutiny. Egypt teaches that unchecked authority, even in a system designed to preserve order, inevitably produces extremes. It is not scandal that defines these rulers, it is the human cost of power without limits. Why we remember them? We remember the controversial pharaohs not because they were worse than others. We remember them because they expose the tension between divinity and humanity, control and collapse, isolation and vulnerability. Their lives show us the danger of conflating respect with fear, obedience with loyalty, and ritual with morality. And they remind us that power is always accountable, to the systems around it, to the people it governs, and ultimately, to history itself. A civilization's last whisper. Egypt's monuments, mummies, and inscriptions remain. They tell stories of grandeur, ambition, devotion, and scandal. Yet, the most important story is subtle. The civilization survived thousands of years by balancing divinity with bureaucracy, faith with administration, and spectacle with enforcement. The controversial pharaohs are not merely cautionary tales, they are mirrors of the system itself, showing us how extraordinary authority shapes behavior, shapes society, and shapes history. After exploring centuries of Egyptian history, a clear pattern emerges. The so-called scandalous pharaohs were not merely products of personal vice, they were products of a system that concentrated absolute power in human hands, shielded it with religion, and rewarded secrecy and isolation. The ultimate failure of divine kingship. Egypt's rulers attempted the impossible, to combine divinity with human authority. For centuries, it worked. Pharaohs commanded armies, managed trade, and oversaw monumental architecture. Their names and deeds were immortalized in stone. But the system carried an inherent flaw: humans cannot embody perfection. Immortality of the crown does not grant wisdom, empathy, or restraint. Scandal and excess were inevitable. Some rulers hid it behind ritual, others through secrecy, but history eventually uncovered the cracks. Even the most celebrated pharaohs, Ramses II, Akhenaten, Cleopatra, were ultimately vulnerable. Their legacies survived, but their absolute authority did not. Why scandal is the wrong focus? It is easy to focus on perversion, decadence, or immorality. But doing so oversimplifies history. The true story is systemic. A civilization that created gods from humans and expected them to remain flawless. When we focus on scandal, we miss the lesson. Power without accountability creates patterns of behavior that destabilize even the most enduring societies. The pharaoh's excesses are not anomalies, they are consequences. What these stories teach modern audiences. Ancient Egypt may seem distant, but its lessons are timeless. Authority must be balanced with accountability. Isolation and secrecy magnify human flaws. Tradition can protect power, but it can also hide dysfunction. Societies endure not because rulers are perfect, but because systems distribute responsibility. The most controversial pharaohs were extraordinary, not because they were uniquely immoral, but because the structures around them allowed extremes to flourish. By this point in history, it is clear that the most controversial pharaohs were not controversial purely because of personal choices. Their behavior was shaped and amplified by the structures around them: the court, religion, tradition, and societal expectations. The invisible influence of court officials. Pharaohs rarely ruled alone. They depended heavily on small circles of advisors, priests, and courtiers. These officials were not neutral. They had ambitions, rivalries, and political agendas. Sometimes they protected the king, sometimes they manipulated him. Greek historians record cases where courtiers effectively controlled the king's daily actions, guiding decisions behind the scenes. This dynamic meant that so-called scandalous behavior was often a product of the court itself, not simply the pharaoh's personal indulgence. Religion as a political tool. Religion in ancient Egypt was inseparable from governance. Pharaohs were presented as divine incarnations, which forced the population to treat them as both political and cosmic authority. Rituals reinforced obedience. Temples and priests validated every action. Divine identity shielded rulers from criticism. When religious ideology protects excess or isolates a ruler, human limitations are magnified. Actions that might have been restrained under normal circumstances could go unchecked under divine authority. Intergenerational pressure and expectations. Royal children were born into a system of extreme expectations. They had little autonomy and were raised to maintain both the family line and the cosmic order. Dynastic marriages. Intermarriage kept divine bloodlines pure, reinforcing political power. Control over behavior. Every action was observed, guided, or restricted. Lack of freedom. Choices were mostly strategic, not personal. This pressure created a cycle of inherited extremes, where each generation was molded to uphold absolute authority, sometimes at the cost of ethical restraint. Long reigns and their consequences. Pharaohs who ruled for decades, like PP2, often faced unique psychological challenges. Isolation reinforced echo chambers of praise. Absolute power intensified self-perception as divine and untouchable. Detachment from reality made the ruler vulnerable to both internal and external crises. Long reigns could create stability, but they also amplified human flaws and set the stage for extraordinary behavior. By the time Egypt entered the late period, the world outside its borders had grown stronger, faster, and far more intrusive. Pharaohs who had once commanded unquestioned authority were increasingly tested by forces they could neither fully predict nor control. What had been private, ritual, court intrigue, and human behavior was now open to observation, interpretation, and manipulation by foreign powers. The consequences were profound. What modern observers often label as scandal was, in many cases, a reflection of systemic vulnerability rather than simple moral failure. In order to understand this, we must examine the external pressures first. Foreign invasions and the exposure of pharaonic vulnerabilities. Ancient Egypt had endured thousands of years of stability, built on geography, strong bureaucracy, and the divine aura surrounding the pharaoh. The deserts, Nile, and natural barriers provided defense, while a well-structured priesthood and court maintained internal order. But when foreign powers arrived, the pharaoh's symbolic divinity became less protective. Persian conquest. The Persian invasions in the 6th century BCE revealed that ritual authority alone could not defend a kingdom. Cambyses' 2nd century into Egypt was not simply a military campaign, it was a psychological assault. Persian forces deliberately mocked Egyptian religious rituals and symbols. Temples were desecrated, sacred spaces violated, and the pharaoh's divine status publicly challenged. Greek historians, such as Herodotus, describe a king whose authority was respected internally but utterly undermined by external perception. Psamtik III, the last pharaoh of the 26th dynasty, was captured alive, paraded, and humiliated. To the Egyptians, this was more than defeat, it was the symbolic collapse of the divine order itself. Greek observers and historical exaggeration. Greek writers were fascinated by Egypt, often portraying its rulers as exotic, indulgent, or morally suspect. These accounts, while biased, highlight a crucial point: visibility matters. Actions that may have been private, court rituals, royal marriages, or dynastic planning, were now observed, misinterpreted, and amplified. What might have been culturally normal within Egypt became scandalous in the eyes of outsiders. And once outsiders recorded these events, the narrative was cemented in history. Roman encounters. By the time Rome expanded into Egypt, the pharaoh's divine authority was largely symbolic. Cleopatra's reign illustrates this tension vividly. Internally, she wielded power skillfully, maintaining alliances and projecting authority. Externally, Roman writers focused on her personal relationships, turning political decisions into tales of moral judgment. Scandal, in this context, was weaponized. By exaggerating personal behaviors or ritual practices, foreign powers justified military or political domination. Public perception, especially among foreign observers, could quickly overshadow internal reality. Scandal as a political weapon. The pharaoh's alleged scandals were rarely neutral. They were observed, interpreted, and often exploited for political purposes. Mocking rituals. When outsiders ridiculed sacred ceremonies, it undermined the perception of divine authority. Highlighting indulgences, Greek and Roman observers emphasized luxury or pleasure in the royal household, framing it as moral decay. Manipulating succession. Questioning a ruler's legitimacy or moral character could destabilize internal loyalty. Pharaohs were uniquely vulnerable because their authority depended on perception. Unlike modern governments, where law, military, or bureaucracy can operate independently, ancient Egyptian rulers relied heavily on belief. If perception faltered, so did the foundation of their power. The interplay of visibility and legacy. Scandal only becomes historical when it is recorded and observed. A minor private issue, such as an internal court dispute, would vanish if unnoticed. Conversely, when foreigners or scribes observed these behaviors, they became enduring elements of legacy. For example, Akhenaten's religious reforms were largely successful internally, but outsiders interpreted them as eccentricity or heresy. Cleopatra's alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were politically calculated, yet Roman propaganda turned them into tales of indulgence and seduction. Visibility shapes narrative, and narrative shapes legacy. Controversy, therefore, is not always an indication of poor judgment. It can be an artifact of exposure. As we move deeper into the late period of ancient Egypt, a crucial theme emerges. Scandal was often systemic, not personal. Pharaohs who are remembered for extravagance, indulgence, or eccentricity were shaped by dynastic pressures, court politics, and the structural demands of divine kingship. Dynastic pressures and the cycle of expectations. Every pharaoh inherited more than a throne. They inherited centuries of tradition, religious duty, and social expectation. This inheritance created intense pressures. Dynastic marriages. Royal siblings often married to preserve divine bloodlines. This practice, while religiously significant, sometimes intensified political and genetic challenges. Heir expectations. Children of rulers were trained from birth to uphold cosmic and political order. Every decision they made carried monumental consequences. Succession scrutiny. Rival factions monitored potential heirs for missteps, real or imagined, creating an environment where behavior was constantly policed. The result was a cycle of behavior that amplified extremes. What outsiders labeled scandal often reflected systemic pressures rather than personal vice. Monuments, art, and the management of image. Pharaohs were masters of narrative control. Their power depended on how others perceived them, and they used art, architecture, and writing to shape that perception. Reliefs and statues, often idealized, presenting the ruler as perfect, divine, and unassailable. Deviations from these images were rarely acknowledged. Temples and inscriptions celebrated achievements, rituals, and victories, often omitting failures or controversial decisions. Historical revision. Some rulers erased the names of predecessors or rivals, deliberately reshaping historical memory. Even in moments of vulnerability, monuments served as psychological armor, preserving the appearance of control and divinity. Human limits and systemic pressures. Pharaohs were extraordinary humans tasked with extraordinary responsibilities. The combination of absolute power, divine expectation, and dynastic pressure often produced behaviors that modern observers label as scandalous. Isolation. Royal households were secluded, limiting exposure to honest counsel. Absolute authority. Without checks, decision-making became increasingly personal and unpredictable. Expectation of perfection. Mistakes were magnified by their symbolic significance. When these pressures converged, human limitations became visible. Scandal, in this context, was the natural consequence of concentrated power. The external perspective and historical record. Much of what we now consider scandal originates from foreign observers. Greek and Roman writers interpreted Egyptian rituals, dynastic marriages, and court behaviors through their own cultural lens. Rituals were seen as indulgent or bizarre. Political alliances and marriages were framed as moral corruption. Long reigns or eccentric reforms were labeled tyranny or debauchery. These narratives endured because they were recorded and transmitted, creating a lasting historical impression. The visibility of pharaonic actions, combined with foreign interpretation, cemented their reputation for scandal. As we explore further, it becomes clear that pharaohs' reputations were shaped not only by personal behavior but by the interplay between internal court dynamics and external observation. The stories of scandal and indulgence often reflect both real pressures and the ways these pressures were interpreted or misinterpreted by history. External observers and the amplification of scandal. Ancient Egypt was never entirely isolated. Foreign traders, diplomats, and invaders constantly monitored the kingdom. Their accounts often shaped what later generations understood as scandalous behavior. Greek accounts. Greek historians frequently framed Egyptian customs, such as royal sibling marriage or ritualistic practices, as bizarre or immoral. Roman propaganda. Roman writers, fascinated by the exotic nature of the pharaohs, emphasized luxurious living and personal indulgence to highlight political weakness. Military invasions. Persian and later Roman incursions exposed the limits of pharaonic power, amplifying the perception of incompetence or moral failure. What might have been private or culturally normative within Egypt was magnified and reinterpreted by foreign observers, creating enduring narratives of scandal. Rituals and religious observance as control. Pharaohs relied heavily on ritual to maintain authority, not just over the population but over the perception of power itself. Public ceremonies. Elaborate rituals reinforced the ruler's divinity and projected control. Temple inscriptions chronicled victories, religious acts, and divine favor while omitting failures or disputes. Priestly oversight. Priests mediated access to the pharaoh, controlling what the public could witness. These structures allowed rulers to hide personal weakness or eccentricity, but paradoxically, they also made any deviation from expected behavior highly visible. One misstep could be interpreted as scandal, magnified by both insiders and outsiders. Monuments as political and psychological strategy. Beyond rituals, monuments themselves served as instruments of narrative control. Reliefs and statues presented the pharaoh as flawless, divine, and eternal. Pyramids and temples symbolized permanence, linking the ruler's authority to cosmic order. Revisionist history. Some pharaohs erased predecessors' names or modified records to reinforce legitimacy. Monuments did more than celebrate achievement, they shaped collective memory, managing both internal and external perceptions of power. Dynastic pressures and personal behavior. Pharaohs were not free agents. Their behavior was shaped by family expectations. Maintaining the royal line and divine bloodline required strategic marriages and succession planning. Court oversight. Advisors and relatives influenced decisions and monitored conduct. Religious obligation. Every choice was measured against the need to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order. Under these pressures, actions that might otherwise be considered personal choices became public and systemic responsibilities. Scandal was often a reflection of the weight of these expectations, not just individual vice. The intersection of scandal and legacy. The lasting legacy of controversial pharaohs was forged in the intersection of visibility, how their actions were observed, interpreted, and recorded. Narrative control, how rituals, monuments, and court management shaped perception. External judgment, how foreign observers amplified or distorted behavior. In many cases, scandal was less a measure of moral failure than a symptom of structural and cultural forces. Understanding these forces is key to separating myth from history. As we conclude our exploration, one truth becomes clear. The most controversial pharaohs were not scandalous purely because of personal flaws. Their actions, eccentricities, and indulgences were amplified by the systems, pressures, and perceptions surrounding them. Understanding their legacy requires examining the intersection of power, visibility, human limitations, and historical narrative. The lesson of human limits and absolute power. Pharaohs wielded extraordinary authority, but even god-kings were still human. Absolute power amplified human strengths and human weaknesses. Isolation. The royal household often insulated rulers from honest counsel, creating echo chambers of praise. Unchecked authority. Decisions were rarely questioned, making mistakes magnified. Expectation of perfection. Every error, real or perceived, had cosmic significance. Even the most competent rulers could be misinterpreted, while those with genuine lapses were remembered disproportionately for scandal. Scandal as a reflection of systems. What historians call scandal often reflects structural realities rather than moral failure. Dynastic pressures, family expectations, marriage practices, and succession disputes constrain choices. Court politics. Advisors and officials shaped and sometimes manipulated rulers' actions. Religious obligation, maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order, added symbolic weight to every decision. External observation, Greek, Roman, and later historians amplified behaviors according to their own cultural lens. Scandal, therefore, is less about individual indulgence and more about the consequence of concentrated, highly visible power. Legacy through monuments and narrative. Pharaohs attempted to control their legacy through art, monuments, and inscriptions. Idealized imagery, statues and reliefs portrayed perfection, obscuring flaws. Architectural symbolism, temples and pyramids linked authority to cosmic order. Historical revision, names of predecessors or rivals could be erased or altered. Yet no monument could fully shield a ruler from history. Visibility, both in life and in the records of observers, ultimately shaped the perception of their reigns. The intersection of power, perception, and history. The most controversial pharaohs illustrate a timeless truth. Human behavior cannot be separated from the structures around it. Power without accountability produces extremes, visibility magnifies flaws, and narrative shapes legacy. Even when scandals were exaggerated, they reveal important insights. Absolute authority is inherently fragile. Systems determine the limits of human behavior. Perception often outweighs reality in determining reputation. Egypt's lasting legacy. Ancient Egypt endures not because of scandal, but because of its systems of governance, ritual, and culture. The pharaohs' lives demonstrate the interaction between human limits and structural pressures, offering lessons far beyond the Nile. Societies must balance authority with accountability. Isolation magnifies human flaws. Tradition protects power but can also conceal dysfunction. Legacy is shaped as much by perception as by action. The most controversial rulers are remembered not because they were immoral, but because their lives reflect the fragile intersection of human ambition, cultural expectation, and absolute authority. Even thousands of years after their reigns, Egypt's pharaohs continue to fascinate us. Modern archaeology, scholarship, and even popular culture have reshaped the way we understand the rulers once labeled perverted, eccentric, or scandalous. Archaeology and the rewriting of history. The tombs, temples, and artifacts left behind tell a story far more nuanced than ancient rumors. Excavations reveal complexity. Bones, inscriptions, and burial practices show that what was once interpreted as indulgence may have been religious or political necessity. Royal mummies. Analysis of mummies has revealed health issues, familial diseases, and even violent deaths that contextualize controversial behavior. Hidden records. Previously unknown letters, stelae, and administrative documents show that some actions interpreted as scandal were strategic or ritualistic. Archaeology allows historians to distinguish between rumor and systemic reality, giving the pharaohs' lives depth beyond ancient gossip. Modern interpretation and cultural bias. Just as Greek and Roman writers imposed their cultural lens, modern media sometimes exaggerates scandal for entertainment. Movies, novels, and documentaries often highlight intrigue, seduction, and decadence because these elements capture attention. Yet contemporary historians strive for a different approach. Evaluating context, not just behavior. Understanding systemic pressures, religious obligations, and dynastic constraints. Recognizing the difference between perception and fact. This modern perspective encourages us to see pharaohs as humans navigating extraordinary circumstances rather than simply moral failures. Controversial pharaohs as case studies in power. Beyond Egypt, the lessons of controversial pharaohs resonate universally. Absolute power isolates. Even divinely sanctioned rulers were vulnerable to poor decision-making when separated from honest counsel. Visibility shapes legacy. Public perception, both domestic and foreign, can define a ruler more than reality. Systems shape behavior. Dynastic expectations, court politics, and religious structures influence human action as much as personal character. Pharaohs like Akhenaten, Cleopatra, and Ramses II illustrate that scandal is often a byproduct of systemic pressures, not merely moral weakness. Archaeology challenges previous assumptions. Recent discoveries continue to revise our understanding. DNA studies, familial relationships, genetic disorders, and health conditions clarify why certain pharaohs behaved or ruled as they did. Administrative records, taxes, trade agreements, and military logs show rulers' practical governance, challenging the image of frivolity. Religious texts, some heretical or unusual rituals were part of broader theological experiments rather than personal eccentricity. In short, modern evidence often vindicates rulers once deemed scandalous, showing their actions were strategic, religiously justified, or culturally normative. Controversial pharaohs are more than historical curiosities. They are case studies in how human limitations interact with absolute authority. The fragility of reputation under scrutiny. The long-term impact of structural, religious, and dynastic pressures. By studying them through both archaeology and critical scholarship, we gain insight not just into Egypt, but into how power, perception, and human behavior interact across history. Scandal may capture attention, but understanding context, systems, and legacy reveals the true story. Even centuries later, these rulers continue to teach lessons that remain surprisingly relevant for leaders, societies, and historians today.